What's up, squad? It's Brandon from the band Tucson. Thank you so much for joining me today. So, just wrapped up watching the Tucker Carlson Putin interview that has recently been given to the world. Yes, Tucker Carlson was able to interview President Vladimir Putin of Russia. It was 2 hours long, but it was well worth the price of admissions for those of us that do this. It was a great opportunity to get insight, unfiltered, from the president of Russia of current day opportunities and risks that he sees in the global environment. And foremost among those would be the conflict with Russia and Ukraine. So I had to go through a couple times, make sure I got those nuggets to continue to make sure that you guys are the most insightful and knowledgeable about these things on the internet today. And these are the nuggets that I picked up. So at the beginning, Tucker does talk about how, with the initial question, pretty much, why are you invading Ukraine? Putin goes on this whole diatribe. It's this opening arguments in front of a grand judiciary type of answer. He talks about, go back a long time ago, about 1,000 years after the birth of Christ. He talk about the Rurik dynasty, the Varanian Guards. So the Varanians, whenever you hear this word, think about Vikings. When you think about people from cold places, Sweden, Denmark, that part of Europe, that Baltic region of Europe. So, for those that know, the Vikings are probably what I would say the early forerunners of what would become known as European global colonization. The Vikings, and it is believed for many reasons, most likely food shortages through a population boom, but the Vikings set out upon the world. And we all know them from the tales of the raping and pillaging, raiding the monasteries, this figure of a bunch of guys with horned helmets set out on long boats with dragon heads invading countries. But the Vikings were also intense traders, and over the long term, they became great merchants in areas that they invaded or settled. And this is go as far as in North America with Eric the Red to the Mediterranean Sea, and in this case, Eastern Europe. And what developed here was this area predominantly settled by what you would call Eastern Slavs, but ruled by these Varanians. And it stretched from the Baltic down to the Black Sea. And this was important because this Black Sea region, which leads to the Mediterranean, historically, this has been the trading nucleus for that Eurasian trade, mostly dominated by the Greeks or the Byzantine Empire. So between this north part, which was dominated primarily in Novgorod, but these northern parts from the Baltic going down to the Black Sea, midpoint roughly being this Kiev or parts of Belarus. These two groups merged. That North-South European trade merged, and the Varanians dominated it, or the Varanian leadership. Now, this to him was Putin setting up where he would have a series basically of repetition where he repeatedly claims that the Russian people or the Ukrainian people are one and the same. And this is when I started to see the holes in this argument. Because I've never really bought into that argument. And the reason why I don't buy into that argument, to me, saying that the Russians and Ukrainians are one people are almost saying the Navajo and Apache are one people. Yes, you can give these correlations and culture and lifestyle, etc. But have they been one cohesive unit divided, such as the Koreans before the North-South split? Was it one nation absolutely divided, or was similar groups occupying massive amount of land without a historic central authority? That is the point. In China, you have these similar people across massive amount of land, but there was a historical precedent for central authority. The central authority precedent that he cites is not even Slav, it's Viking, it's Varanian. So not only that, the Moscow grew out of a far eastern principality of these regions. The Grand Duchies of Moscow eventually um, through navigation amongst the Mongol hordes and politics, but were eventually solidified and built out under the first Tsar, who is Ivan the Terrible. This was not in Kiev, this was in Moscow. So I always see a distinction between this northern part of Asia or northern part of Eastern Europe where Moscow sits and this southern Mediterranean or this Black Sea bordering region, which these Ukrainians reside. Yes, these are Eastern Slavic people, but because of the breadth and distance, I never saw it as one source of this group. And of course, there are commonalities such as closely tied language or a religion, but one people, one history, one central authority. This is where I am not accepting the whole this is one nation argument. And this is very important because he continuously do what I feel is contradict himself. He constantly references Ukrainians' drive for independence. And granted, I couldn't find a map of Ukraine before the 1900s. But I can say the same thing about Germany before the 1800s. That doesn't mean it was not a German nation there to be solidified. But you don't find the modern day Ukrainian state before the 1900s, but you do find for centuries prior this desire for these Ukrainian people to see themselves as independent and distinct, whether from all these overlords, whether it was the Polish or whether it was the Russians. It was this search for a distinct identity. And he likes to try to clump this in, I think, with Nazism, which I think is a buzzword that he uses to try to bypass the logic to get to an emotional desire on his end. But he constantly talks about this desire for the Ukrainians, and he even says at one point, Ukrainians want to be different, so be it. But then he even ends the interview by saying these are one people that must be united. And I think this is the straw man argument. I think this is trying to put logic over something much more pragmatic. That's what's really going on. And it's not the desire for one people. He's not trying to annex Belarus. This is about control of spheres of influence. And you'll see this bitterness comes out, whether it's the Secret Service. And of course, he says the Secret Service has a lot of sway. Well, that's what happens when you rotate the leader every 4 to 8 years. So, of course, the people that stay, when you have an absent landlord, of course, the tenants become empowered. This is something Putin wouldn't understand because he's been in power or had his hands on or near the wheels of power since the 90s. So, of course, America is going to have a bureaucracy. It's going to have the elites. All groups are oligarchs. But the difference is, and this is a great advantage that we're going to get into, is how malleable the American machine is on creating new groups. And what you see is these old war autocratic states with that inability to do so because they have one ruler in power and they become so synonymous with authority that drastic acts such as coups and wars are the only way to remove them from authority. And they almost see themselves and their leadership as synonymous with the existence of state, which is erroneous. Now, it was a couple other things, and that's why I say he does have this great knowledge of history, but I see, for those that know the history, you can see how he rides the wave to say what he wants to say and avoid saying things. He doesn't talk in history about Brest-Litovsk when the Russians who pulled out of World War I a year earlier, they signed that with Germany, and it clearly delineated the various states within Russia, whether that's the Baltics, Ukraine, the Caucasus. All of these were conceded, but this treaty was made annul after World War I, a year later when the Germans lost it. But when the Russians left and the communists took over, they wanted to end the war, and the Germans made them concede a lot of land and a lot of resources. But with that land and resources, it was based on delineations of sovereignty amongst the groups that saw themselves as distinct from Russians. This was another instance of Ukrainian separation of identity to me. He doesn't talk about Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in 1939 in Moscow, which pretty much broke out fears of influence amongst the same countries in Eastern Europe and led to the partitioning of Poland. He talks about Ukrainian nationalists working with Nazis, but he completely glosses over the fact that Soviets worked with the Nazis as well in the partitioning of Eastern Europe. The Nazis and communists, the Nazis for the facts, were never pro-communist. But I will say this, in power initially, because Hitler wanted to get things done, the Nazis and communists were friends before they were enemies. They were friends before they were enemies based on how they sliced and diced Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact led to an annexation freaking extravaganza of the communists of Russia between what they did as far as Finland, the Baltics, and as far as Eastern Europe, Poland, Ukraine, etc. He also doesn't talk about the Holodomor, which many believe was the organized starvation of Ukraine. Ukraine, the second largest country in Europe, known historically as the breadbasket of Europe, lost millions of people in what many believe was an organized effort to starve out or depopulate the region. So these are numerous instances where the Russian and Ukrainian people were not one and the same. And I think he completely glossed over these things. And I think they're not only factually relevant, but even more modern, which give them the greater basis of weight. Because this is in the recent history. This is for the grandparents and great-grandparents of the modern Ukrainians, how they experienced the world. Was Russia heavily influenced in Ukraine, and Ukraine was a satellite up until 2014? Of course. But do Ukraine have a leg to stand on when they speak of Ukrainian nationality and identity? Of course. Now, you can say, how big is Ukraine? He speaks of the left bank and west bank, and I've always said, hey, let's get this. I think this thing's going to land somewhere on the Dnieper, separating, dividing the country between the east and the west. But the geopolitics are so inherent. When these things first went down, the first thing Putin did was take Crimea. Why? Because geopolitics necessitated that he have access to the warm water ports of the Mediterranean. Like, it wasn't about, oh, this is where the Rurik dynasty or our historical anchor. No, geopolitics. He wanted to secure his sea access. It comes out. It is true. NATO encroached onto the Soviet Union. And I think that's really what this comes down to. This is the geopolitical nugget of it all. He speaks of two things, the power of China, and he speaks of access capacity. He thinks one of the reasons that he's been targeted is because of the access capacity, which he kind of attributes to the intelligence services and these people trying to find value by demonizing Russia. But I find it's the access capacity that I think when the Soviet Union went down, I think America did two things. They say, wow, that was really close, or closer than we wanted it to be, or the number two, which is, what are we going to do about our markets? Basically, the world has been bifurcated. America and Russia, they are not complementary. They are competitive. And the reason why I say this is because these are both big countries with great resources to sell to the world. With the Soviet Union in the second world and America in the first world, America had this ability to dominate these markets in trade. And because of the backwardness or the inherent regression in communism, Russia, Soviet Union was backwards. Now, coming with the age of Putin and the breakup of Soviet Union, you get market liberalization. So what do you do when you have market liberalization? You have all these new Russian goods coming on to the market. This creates greater levels of competition for America. Now they'll be competing because America's strategy has always been, let's control Europe. Since World War I, so World War II especially, control Europe, manage Asia. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union, you have this freaking bevy of resources right on the doorstep of Europe, embedded into Europe, better yet, closer to Germany, closer to France. How do America control that? When the goods and flows of energies and all the precious things that Europe need, they can get right next to their neighbor. And I think this was a great threat to America. And America wanted to say, Russia, if you come into the fold, like Putin said, what if I wanted to join NATO? I mean, they say, yeah, but I think they want to make sure if Russia was in the NATO, that America will have their thumb on Russia. And this will lead to a synergy for bigger problems in larger countries such as China or India down the road. But at first, it requires Russia to come under the American heel. And I think that's kind of what the antagonism in the West is and why America has been so dead set on basically the encroachment of Russia. But I think Russia's in a precarious position. I think it does show a lot that with all these sanctions, they're able to survive. It speaks to the necessity of having inherent wealth, national identity, etc. These things have done them well many times as the rest for their economy while fighting this war. But the breakup or tripolar state of the world will continue, and how and where Russia lands right now is finding some solace amongst his Asian neighbors of India and China, which has stepped in to take up some of its resources. But at the end of the day, I think the West wants to come in. They want to establish control over Russia. And I think Putin wants to stay in the power. So it was a great interview as far as I'm concerned because it was a conversation. I didn't really care if it was more antagonistic. I actually appreciate the conversation because it was a lengthy one. And when you have those lengthy conversations, it allows a person to be more themselves. And I think Putin showed his hands a couple times. But it was great. But I would love to hear your thoughts because this is going to continue to evolve. And I think the West have to come on. Now it's to a point now where they're saying, both sides are saying, how do we end this thing, if we end this thing at all? Maybe Ukraine will be the next Korea. And we just have this armistice that lasts for decades on decades on decades. So let me hear your thoughts. Comment below, like, share, subscribe if you enjoy the content. Until next time, take care. Bantu up.